Okay, Algebra 1, let's take a look at our last lesson of the year here. We have a couple big ideas. A lot of things are going to start relating to each other, and now it's up to you to use your skills and decide what's best. Okay? So here's the first big idea. How do you solve quadratic equations when they're in standard form? Okay, so here's an equation. It's quadratic because the power is 2, and standard form means it goes from highest power to the least power. Now I'm noticing that we already have to have our 0, and let's just make sure equations must equal 0. And if it's not, then just move everything over so that we have the 0. Okay, so the first thing we could do is we could solve by factoring. So we're going to go ahead and make some boxes for this. And the first term, 3x squared, goes in that box. Negative 24 goes in that box. If I take a look at the multiply number, 3 times negative 24. 3 times negative 24 is negative 72. And the add number is 14. Okay, how am I going to multiply to a negative? One of them has to be negative. Let's see, is it 8 times 9? Well, that doesn't add to 14. How about 18 times 4? Okay, so if you look at your calculator, 18 times 4 makes 72, but one of them needs to be a negative. And I'm going to make 4 be the negative so that they add to a positive. When these go in the boxes, make sure you put the x's. 18x, and it's time to factor out the greatest common factor here. If it starts with a negative, take out a negative 4. Chain reaction, this has to be a 6. Chain reaction here, that has to be a 3x. This has to be an x. Perfect, it works. Okay, solve by factoring. Step 1, make sure it's got the 0. Step 2, factor. 3x minus 4 times x plus 6 equals 0. Step 3, we're going to split it up into 2 equations. Okay. And step 4, solve these little equations. 3x equals a positive 4. Divide both sides by 3. I got the answer 4/3. Minus 6, and the answer x equals negative 6. I got 2 answers, one positive, one negative. Okay. Sometimes equations can't be factored though, and we have to use the quadratic formula. So let's just refresh everybody on the steps to solving with the quadratic formula. First of all, the formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Big all over. Make sure it goes underneath the b there. Looking at this equation, a is a 3, b is 14, c is negative 24. Okay, now I'm going to use the quadratic formula. What is the negative b, or the opposite of b? Negative 14 plus or minus the square root of b squared. Make sure you put b in parentheses. Square it. Minus 4 times the a times the c number. Okay, all over 2 times the a number, 2 times 3. And then this is when we always just pick up our calculator, okay, and use the fraction button. So the first thing I'm going to do is get the alpha y equals. And in the numerator, I'm going to type it exactly the way it is. Negative 14 plus the square root of parentheses 14 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 24. And then get down in the denominator for 2 times, I'll use parentheses. Okay, so I typed everything with the plus sign here. And one of my answers is, oh, look at that, 4/3, just like this other answer was. Okay, so my first solution is 4/3. Now you have to do the exact same thing again to get the other answer, but this time use a minus sign in your calculator. And the fastest way to do that is to go back up and get it, okay, or hit second enter. And I'm going to go up here and I'm going to move over and change that plus sign to a minus sign. So now I'm going to use the quadratic formula with the minus sign on top and get the second answer, which is x equals -6. Okay, two solutions because it's a quadratic equation. Okay, so you got two options to solving a quadratic equation. Now, how do you solve quadratic equations when they're in vertex form? Okay, so let's talk about a couple other solving skills. Okay, so this is review. This is just a two-step linear equation. Okay, notice right here it's linear. Linear because it's x to the first power. Okay, has only one solution. If you only have one x, you're going to have one answer. Okay, so let's just do our steps. First, I'll subtract 6. What you do to the left, you do to the right. So now we have 3x equals 6. So this is more of semester 1 algebra. Is x alone? Not quite. He's being multiplied by a 3. So I'm going to do the opposite and divide by 3. And what you do to the left, you do to the right. So x equals 2. Okay. So when you're solving for x, first, get the other term on the other side. Get that out of there and make the x term be the only term. Okay, we're trying to isolate the x. All right, what about something like this? Okay, now I notice this is quadratic. Quadratic is going to have two solutions. Okay, so we have to be a little more careful here. Step 1 is still going to be subtract 6 from both sides. Okay, let's subtract 6. 3x squared equals 6. Okay, so I've got the x term as the only term. Now it's still not alone because it's being multiplied by 3, so we're still going to divide both sides by 3. And x squared equals 2. Okay, now I have to get two answers. What's the opposite of squaring? And the answer is square rooting. Okay, so you square root the left, and what you do to the left, you have to do to the right. So now, x squared, these cancel each other out and it's just an x. Okay, but now we have to get two answers. So over here, you say plus or minus radical 2. So one of the answers is positive radical 2, and the other answer is negative radical or square root of 2. So there's your two solutions. Okay. Whenever you have a quadratic, you have to get two solutions, and it's plus or minus. Okay, let's take a look at another little example right here, just the squaring thing. Let's say x squared equals 9. I would square root the left, square root the right, and so there's two answers, plus or minus. Okay, what I always do is take the number, okay, and let's square root 9 in the calculator. If it comes out exact like 3, then we write plus or minus 3. How come I didn't do that up here? Well, the square root of 2 is not a perfect square, came out to be an irrational decimal, so I'll just leave it as radical 2. Okay, so the two answers here are 3 and negative 3. Okay, why are there two answers? Well, it says x squared equals 9. Is that true? If I type a 3 and I square it, does that make a 9? Absolutely. What if I type negative 3 and I square it? That answer also makes a 9. Okay, so whenever you square root, you get plus or minus. Let's write that down officially. Okay, when we square root, we get, I'm going to say, plus or minus answer. Okay, plus or minus, we get two answers. All right, if you have questions on calculator and radicals, let's make sure you ask me those tomorrow. All right, let's keep going. Here's a couple of equations. We have to solve them by undoing. Okay, so we're going to take a look at each little step here, one at a time. So the first thing I'm noticing is that the x term is not the only term. So let's go ahead and add 6 to both sides. Okay, so now we've got 3 times x minus 2 squared equal to a 6. All right, we're getting closer, but the x is still not isolated. Let's divide both sides by 3. Divide both sides by 3. X minus 2 quantity squared equals a 2. Okay? Now I have to be very careful here. I cannot add 2 because this whole quantity is being squared. It's stuck in the quantity. I have to undo squared power. And the way you undo a squared power is by taking the square root. I'll square root the left and square root the right. Okay, and then the squared power cancels out. And then you just have x minus 2. Okay, now remember, when you square root, you get plus or minus radical 2. Plus or minus. Whenever you draw a radical sign, put plus minus in front of it. Okay, is the x alone? I'm going to have to add 2 and add 2. So x is equal to positive 2 plus or minus the radical 2. So what are the two answers here? We have 2 plus radical 2 as my first solution, and then we have 2 minus radical 2 as the second solution. Okay, so we're getting into some fancy solving here. All right, let's take a look at this last one here. I want to solve for x by undoing. Okay, the first thing you do is divide both sides by 3. Divide by 3. That cancels out. So we have quantity squared equals 16. Okay, now I can't add 2 because this is a quantity that's being squared. So now it's time to square root. Square root, the opposite of squaring is square rooting, because we're going to undo that, and then we just have this quantity. But over here, don't forget plus and minus. Hey, is 16 a perfect square? The square root of 16 is a 4. So let's write 4. Let's write plus or minus 4. Perfect. Okay, now we'll add 2, and we'll add 2. I like to write the 2 first, and then say plus or minus 4. Okay, so what are the two solutions? The first one is 2 plus 4, and the second one is 2 minus 4. So one's with the plus sign, one's with the minus sign. So our first solution is 6, and our second solution is negative 2. Okay, these are solutions. Let's take a look at how we're going to use this, okay? Because sometimes we're going to give you these parabolas that are in vertex form, and we're going to have to use this solving, these skills here, to get our x-intercepts. The vertex is the same as it's always been, okay? When it's in vertex form, don't forget about the change. So it's going to be 1, negative 8. Okay, so I'm going to go to positive 1. I'm going to go to negative 8. There it is. This parabola opens up. Let's just write that down so I make sure I draw an opening up parabola. Axis of symmetry, it's always x equals, and it's going to be that number 1. I'm going to draw the axis of symmetry over here so that everything on the parabola is nice, even Steven. Symmetric, reflection on both sides. A y-intercept. To find a y-intercept, to find the y number, you let x equal 0. Okay, to find the y number. So to find the y number, I'm going to use this equation and make x be a 0. Now be careful, that negative 8, that is not the y-intercept. Okay, that's the vertex. To calculate a y number, you have to make x be a 0. So a lot of people use their calculator for this, or you can just do it by hand. Negative times negative is positive. 2 minus 8 is negative 6. So over here on the graph, I've got 1 point at 0, negative 6. And I'm going to reflect that and have another point on the right-hand side. Okay, now it's time to switch pens for the important thing. To find an x-intercept, I need to know the x number. Okay, you let y equal 0. Let y equal 0. To find y-intercept, we make the x number 0. So where's this equation? I need to put 0 into the y spot. Not the x spot, but the y spot. And now I got to calculate the x number. Okay, it looks like I'm going to have to use some of my undoing skills. If you don't like the 0 on this side, did you know you can write the 0 on the other side? Some people like to work always to the right. It doesn't matter. You could say equals 0. So step 1 would be to add 8 to both sides. So 2 times the quantity equals 8. Perfect. Okay. Now step 2 would be to not add 1, no, divide by 2. Okay, let's get that out of there. Divide both sides by 2. Okay. Now I see this quantity is being squared. To undo squaring, we square root. X minus 1, this all goes away. Let's see, does square root of 4 come out perfect? The square root of 4 is 2. Okay, but don't forget to say plus or minus 2. Okay, so we're ending up with two solutions here. Let's add 1 and add 1. Okay, so we've got x equals 1 plus or minus 2. So x is 1 plus 2, and then the other answer is 1 minus 2. So it looks like I'm getting the two answers, 3 and negative 1. All right, so over here on my answer line, one of the answers was 3, 0, but there's another point, negative 1, 0. Let's go see if that makes sense with our graph. 2 x-intercepts, negative 1, and positive 3. Well, it certainly seems symmetric across the axis of symmetry, and it definitely makes sense with a parabola that's opening up. Okay, so everything on the graph should start to click together nicely. It is making sense and it's working. Okay, the graph is almost like a check. If something here went wrong with the calculations, it wouldn't look good. Okay, all right, I hope this makes sense, and I can't wait for you to practice our last lesson. Thanks, guys.